The story of the first Thanksgiving, the first feast, is often filled with lore, assumptions, and loads of misconceptions. I have been interested in this story for years. Each year I read and reread some of the journals written by the Pilgrims. The story of the Pilgrims is a plight, a search for freedom of worship, a war against the wicked world and the ways of England, an escape to Holland, and ultimately a treacherous journey across the Atlantic. I put together their story using mainly their own words, and only briefly including my own interpretation when a small determination of events is needed. It is my desire to bring to life their words, their story, and their gratitude, as was recorded by their own hands. Their names are many. I have only included brief mentions of specific names, since each and every name carries their own story. Over time, perhaps I may find it pleasing to tell their individual stories. For now, please enjoy this narrative of the flight of the saints and their journey to the New World. According to William Bradford, a pilgrim, the reason the people who will become known as the Pilgrims left England was because of, as Bradford puts it, the breaking out of the light of the gospel in England. He is referring to his believed corruptedness of the Church of England and also a recently translated English Bible, which allowed people like him to interpret the gospel for themselves. There were many groups that called themselves reformers and were trying to establish their right to worship God without what he claims as the mixture of men's inventions. To pursue this, they read and studied an English version of the Bible, which was not approved by the King of England. It was considered heretical to have one. These soon-to-be pilgrims read it in secret, for if they were found to have it in their possession, the result would be serious consequences. These people were, in Bradford's words, hunted and persecuted on every side until their former afflictions were but as flea-bitings in comparison. Some were clapped into prison, others had their houses watched night and day and escaped with great difficulty. Most had to leave their homes and find a new means to live. Even with all the dangers of meeting, they did meet together in secret each Sabbath day for about a year, when ultimately it was decided time to find a new place to live. They chose Holland as a suitable place, since it was a center of religious toleration. They also wanted to leave as soon as they could. Bradford said, for these reformers to be thus constrained to leave their native soil, their lands and livings, and all of their friends was a great sacrifice, and was wondered by many. To make matters more difficult, as intolerable as it was for them to stay, they were not allowed to go. The ports were shut against them, so they had to seek a secret means to leave. Not only did they have to worship in secret, they had to leave in secret. They tried bribing captains of ships, offering extraordinary rates for their passage. We really do not know how many times that they were betrayed. Bradford wrote of at least 2 of them. He said, a large number had decided to take passage from Boston in Lincolnshire and had hired a ship to themselves and made an agreement with the captain to be ready at a convenient place on a certain day to take them and their belongings. After long waiting and great expense, he had not kept that day with them. He came at last and took them aboard at night. But when he had secured their goods, he betrayed them. He had previously arranged this with his crew. They put them in boats, and there they were ransacked and searched. Their money and precious items were all taken, their belongings, money, and books. Then they were taken to the magistrates and tattled on for trying to leave illegally. The magistrates were kind, but did not release them for an entire month, of which they waited in prison. 7 of their leaders were left in prison afterwards. It was a political mess. They had broken the law, but now the question about what to do with these people. The following spring, Another attempt by the same people was made. They heard about a Dutchman who had a ship of his own, eventually making an agreement with him, and they hoped that he was more reliable than the former captain they had dealt with. He told them that he would load their boat away from any major town and promised them that they had nothing to fear. The women, the children, and all their belongings were all loaded onto a small boat to meet up with a larger ship. The men were to meet by land at the loading location. But the boat had arrived a day before the ship. The women were becoming so sick they brought the boat into the harbor for the night. To make matters worse, their boat became stuck in the mud. When the ship arrived, the captain saw that he needed to start getting the men boarded. After the first boat had arrived and they had boarded the ship, a large group of men on horseback armed with guns and other weapons were quickly arriving to capture and arrest these people. The Dutchman captain yelled out "Sacramente," hoisted the sails, and away they went. Of course, the men on board were worried about their wives, their children, but they were captured. They left England in this state of nothingness. No family, no money, no clothes, except which they were wearing. And away to Holland they went. Imagine that. Their voyage wasn't even pleasant. 14 of the 7 days it was stormy. Even the sailors were shrieking, "We sink, we sink!" They prayed, and the storm soon subsided. What about those left behind? The women and the children wept. It was a pitiful sight. The English officials moved them from place to place. The children cried for both fear and cold. They had no homes to go to, no jobs, and their standing was in legal peril. But they did not shrink away in their cause. They pressed forward with new courage. They all got over to Holland, some from one place, some from another, and they, of course, met back up with tremendous rejoicing. Their story does not end in the Netherlands, as we know. More must happen for these people to ultimately become the pilgrims that we celebrate at Thanksgiving. In the Netherlands, they were met with grand fortified cities. This was a great place of trade with merchants everywhere. Different manners, different customs, strange fashions in clothing, but they paid little attention to these things. For they had their own war to wage. They had the war of poverty that came swiftly to them. In this war, they were armed with their faith and their patience. In the end, they achieved victory. The year 1609. When they arrived, they found a more permanent place in Leiden. Leiden, famous in the day because of a great university. Through hard and continual work, they earned a comfortable living. They continued in this way for several years and worshipped under the guidance of Mr. Robinson and Mr. Brewster, elders of their church. After 11 years had passed, several of them had died. Many others were now old. Many decided it was time to move yet again. Some of their reasons for this were they could not endure the continual labor. They were not satisfied with the inconveniences. Many were starting to adopt to the ways of the Leideners. There had to be a better and an easier place of living, a place where their children did not have to bear such a heavy yoke of burden, the parents' burden. Children were forced to work, and their bodies were becoming bowed under the weight, and they became decrepit even in their youth. But even more powerful of their sorrows was that the children were being influenced by the young people of the country, the temptations of the city, and as Bradford wrote, getting the reins off their necks and leaving their parents. Some became soldiers. Others embarked on voyages. The parents saw that their posterity was in danger. Their last reason, an important one to them, was that they had a hope and an inward zeal of laying good foundations for the advancement of the gospel in yet another remote part of the world. They fixed their minds on America, which they had heard were fruitful and fit for habitation, devoid of civilized inhabitants and filled with others that ranged up and down the land. They knew that they could face famine and want, dangers, possibly even death from the voyage itself. Above all this, they knew that their actions would be great and honorable and accompanied with difficulty, but they could answer with courage. The dangers were great, but not desperate. The difficulties would be many, but not invincible. After long conversations into late nights and much arguing on all factions, it was decided to execute their plan by the best means they could. They decided to live in Virginia, in the New World, a fruitful land where colonists had already settled, but they also wanted to ensure that they lived far enough away from those settlements so as not to ruin their great experiment. 2 members of their congregation were sent to England to arrange the matter. They found the Virginia Company anxious to have them and willing to work with them. The king had some major concerns, however, especially that of religion. But the congregation thought that they would be far enough away from the king's rule that they could make it work. They decided to give it a go. After many more long conversations, a persuasion on all sides, a patent was procured and granted. When word came to Leiden that the patent was procured, they immediately began deciding which members would be going first and how many. It was also decided that if their experiment worked, that the rest would come quickly and join them in the New World. A new man pops into their story, a Mr. Weston. Weston knew some of the members, knew of their plight, and he had knowledge that a bunch of lords had received a grant from the king for more northerly parts, a part now called New England. Here fishing was plentiful. Here is where he persuaded them to switch their plans and go with this rich group of lords that he called the adventurers. Some had already sold their property. Some had put everything into the Virginia Company plan, and now it was foiled. Ultimately, it was decided to go with Weston's idea. Of course, this would take more time. Time to prepare, time to plan again, time to procure a ship and finalize a patent. This was a great strain on these people. It was confusing and hard. Of course, there were conditions to agree to with the adventurers. Some of these conditions, though not all of them were, the persons transported would work for the adventurers for 7 years. During that time, all profits would be kept and divided equally after 7 years as a common stock. Any children that go and are now under the age of 10 shall have no share, but be given 50 acres of land. All food, drinking, clothing, and any provision shall come out of a common stock. Of course, with these conditions, more discussion, more arguing, more choices. But they decided to put the plan into place. A small ship, the Speedwell, was purchased by their pooled together money and fitted out in Holland, and was thought that it would be of help to them in the New World. Another ship, the Mayflower, was hired at London of about 180-ton measurement. When the day of departure from Leiden arrived, there was great celebration and great sorrow. Some even left their children behind, in the hopes that they could send for them after their difficult journey was over and they became established. The wind was fair, with sighs and sobs were heard as the ship set sail. Tears gushed from every eye, and many speeches pierced every heart. The tide which stays for no man called away. Their pastor fell to his knees, and with most fervent prayers blessed them. A prosperous wind brought them quickly to Southampton, where the Mayflower was waiting. The Leideners, upon reaching the rest of their congregation in England, found out the terms had changed. Their contract was different. One of the changes was they were now required to work for the adventurers 6 days a week. Previously, it was only 5. The only day not devoted to the adventurers was the Sabbath day. And to make these matters worse, the adventurers had more people that were not part of their congregation, and they were going with them. From this point forward, I will refer to these people as the strangers. We have the saints and the strangers. Together collectively, we call them the pilgrims. Without much more conversing and awkward conversation, they set sail, disgruntled that the adventurers are sending strangers with them, angry that this upends their plans. They had little choice but to keep trudging forward. Onward ho! They put to sea. They had not gone very far when Mr. Reynolds, the captain of the Speedwell, complained that she was leaky, and he dare not go any further until she was mended. So the captain of the Mayflower and Reynolds decided to put into Plymouth to get her mended. The ship was searched from stern to stern. Some leaks were found and mended. With great hope they put to sea again, and they could scarcely keep her above the sea with pumping, and they returned again, and the ship was judged to be too weak. They dismissed the Speedwell. They moved as much of their provisions as they could onto the Mayflower and decided which persons could no longer attend and must stay behind. Of an interesting note in the story, the Speedwell, the smaller ship that was dismissed, was discovered to have a mast put in her that was too big. Some historians believe that the captain did this on purpose to make her unreliable at sea, but also easily remedied once the Pilgrims had dropped her. The Speedwell set sail for many more years after the mast was fixed. The Speedwell, then, was perhaps essentially stolen from the saints. September 6th, in the year of 1620, the Mayflower set sail on her famous voyage. Hanging from the side, a rowboat was packed with animals, rabbits, chickens, geese, and ducks. On board, you could find pigs, goats, and sheep. The amounting excitement, I'm sure, could be heard by voices of people and animals alike. There was a prosperous wind, and soon many on board became sick, which is to be expected. There was, however, a young sailor who loved to make fun of the sick pilgrims. He called them names, he cursed at them, and made statements like, "I can't wait to throw half of you overboard." He was referring to what happens if you die at sea. You are tossed into the ocean for a watery burial. Ironically enough, this same sailor became sick himself, dying in a very desperate manner, and was in fact the first to be thrown overboard. On board the Mayflower, the meals of the ship's biscuits, cheese, peas, turnips, cabbages, onions, parsnips, herring, and other salted fish. Dried ox tongues. Of course, to consume these foods, and to sometimes mask the flavor of spoiled foods, herbs were of extreme importance. Some of these herbs are commonly found in our own pumpkin pie spices. Those of nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and mace. And for drinking, their daily ration of beer. Cooking on the Mayflower was, of course, for calm days, when little wind blew and the passengers were allowed on deck to build small fires in sandboxes. Care had to be taken for the hot embers to avoid burning of the ship. When these days happened, hot meals could be prepared, but for most of the voyage, it was hard biscuits and cold porridge. Salt spray from the ocean built up on the clothing, making it itchy, crusty, smelly. Clothing became dirtier and smellier by the day. Clothes are not washed at sea. The trip was not one of luxury. It was a true pilgrimage, a people looking to start a new life, a life devoted to worship and freedom. This came with the cost of discomfort and months at sea. After the Mayflower and its voyagers had enjoyed many wonderful windy days at sea, a fierce storm came and the ship began to leak. The main beam bent and cracked, and most feared that the ship would be unable to complete her voyage. Many wanted to turn the ship around and return, but since they were already halfway, it was decided, in the end, to continue. The ship was sound under the waterline, which gave them little encouragement. One of the passengers had brought a huge iron screw with them. They put a post under it and were able to hoist up the beam, fasten it, and made the ship once more seaworthy. As long as they did not overpress the ship's sail, they should be fine. They committed themselves and resolved to proceed. Because of the condition of the boat, in strong winds, the ship was forced to lower the sails and float, whole at sea, sometimes for days at a time. Once, during a terrible storm, John Howland, a young man, fell into the sea. He was lucky as he happened to catch hold of a topsail halyard that was overboard. As the sea tossed at times, he was deep under water, but some men were able to haul him back on deck by the rope, and he survived. This whole time at sea, only one passenger has died. He was a servant, William Button. On November the 11th, they saw land. It was Cape Cod. The search was on for a place to live. The original plan was to head to the area of the Hudson River, farther south. But after attempting to navigate around the Cape, they discovered many rocky barriers and a lot of wind, making it nearly impassable. After the Mayflower had nearly crashed against the shoals, it was decided to turn back to the safety of the Cape. These people, being at sea for so long, leaving everything they knew behind them, had winter approaching quickly. If they looked behind them, there was the mighty roaring of the ocean, and in front of them was the unknown land. The captain wanted them off the boat. He had his own crew to get back to England before winter, and food resources on the ship were running out quickly. Time was of the essence. Much can be said of what happened next. The days and days of exploring, they have stories of their own, looking for a suitable place to make a new home. But on to 15th of November in 1620, 16 men left the main ship to go on shore to explore. They were led by Captain Miles Standish, their military leader. Armed with both weapons and armor, they must have looked ready for war. On the shore, 5 or 6 Native Americans watched and eventually disappeared in the thick forest. In their exploration, they discovered corn, which had been stored carefully in some heavy dirt mounds. Yes, they stole it. They unearthed it. They took it, and they promised that the day would come when they would return it to its rightful owners. They needed food. They needed seed. They knew they were stealing. They felt badly, but their want overcame them. If it were not for this, perhaps starvation would set in quicker. Many more explorations took place, and finally on the 16th of December of the year 1620, they found a place that they wanted to call home. In fact, it was on the 25th of December, Christmas Day, that they began to erect their first house for common use. Of course, it was the saints who didn't see that Christmas should be celebrated, since it is not mentioned in the Bible. The strangers, however, had a very different idea. It was ultimately decided that the strangers could celebrate Christmas, and the saints would begin building their future, since to them it was not a holy day. To keep the narrative brief, by March, about a half of the pilgrims had already died. Sickness, hunger, starvation, all causes. They would bury their dead in the night. They didn't want to appear weak to the natives. They would march around with their weapons and their armor. They wanted to appear strong and fierce. They put the same armor onto different men and marched around. They wanted to appear mighty in numbers. They put on a show, anything to prevent the natives from seeing their weakness. In the end, however, this weakness of theirs would in fact be noticed from the natives, and it was the natives that would give them their eventual success and survival. On the 16th of March, 1621, a native came walking straight up to them. The pilgrims were shocked and alarmed, but he began speaking in English, at which they were very astonished. His name was Samoset. He told them of another named Squanto. Squanto could speak English very well because he had actually lived in England. He promised he would return to them with Squanto. About 5 days later, Massasoit, the local sachem, arrived with Squanto. Gifts were exchanged, and they made a peace with each other that continued until the death of these leaders. The terms of peace included: they would not harm each other. They would not steal from each other, and if they had, they would return it. If they needed help in a time of attack, the others would come and assist. It was this agreement that may have made the eventual first feast we call Thanksgiving possible, the agreement of mutual protection. Squanto ended up staying with the Pilgrims. He did show them how to plant corn, where fishing was plentiful, and he never left them till he himself died. Squanto's story itself is interesting. He was sold as a slave by Spain. He got away to London and was finally brought back to the New England, to be very brief. But more about this amazing year for the Pilgrims, the year 1621. Squanto taught them much, especially in the culture of this new crop corn. He taught them to manure the soil with fish in old soil. He showed them that in April plenty of fish would come up a small stream, and he taught them how to catch them. The English tried planting their seeds of peas and wheat, which failed in the New World. Of interesting note, May the 12th, 1621, the very first marriage in the colony. Later on, a young Billington son became lost in the forest and was discovered by the same people that they stole the corn from. Word reached the Plymouth colony of where he was. A group of men went to get him. Peace was made as the corn was returned in exchange for the boy. The Pilgrims were getting a reputation for being honest, fair, but English. The famous first feast is perhaps a bit of folklore mixed with fact. Very, very little is known about the event besides what is written in a journal of the Pilgrims at Plymouth called Mort's Relation. Here it reads not only of the first feast, but also the food that was available locally. Here is how it reads. We set last spring some 20 acres of Indian corn and sowed some 6 acres of barley and peas. And according to the manner of Indians, we manured our ground with herring, or rather shads, which we have in great abundance, and take with great ease at our doors. Our corn did prove well, and God be praised. We had a good increase of Indian corn, and our barley indifferent good, but our peas not worth the gathering, for we feared they were too late sown. Then came up very well and blossomed, but the sun parched them in the blossom. Now here's the bit that mentions that very first feast. I will point out that the only food specifically mentioned that they ate was deer. Fowl are mentioned, but that could mean ducks, geese, swans, and of course, there were turkeys in the area. But which of the fowls they ate, we do not know. As I also read from this journal, you will notice that 90 Indians showed up. Perhaps they heard the guns firing for games or even fowling. Perhaps they came running to play their part in offering mutual protection to the Pilgrims. Surely they were not invited guests originally, but when they came, the feast kept going. Here are the words that the Pilgrims wrote. Our harvest, being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so we might after special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labors. They, 4 in one day, killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest King Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to our governor, and upon the captain and others. To end this presentation, let me end it in the words of the Pilgrims, their words of thanks, their gratitude of abundance, and perhaps some more clues about the food that might have been enjoyed by the week-long festivities of the famous first Thanksgiving. I have never in my life remembered a more seasonable year than we have here enjoyed. And if we have once but kine, horses, and sheep, I make no question but men might live as contented here as in any part of the world. For fish and fowl we have great abundance. Fresh cod in the summer is but coarse meat with us. Our bay is full of lobsters all the summer, and affordeth variety of other fishes. In September, we can take a hogshead of eels in a night with small labor, and can dig them out of their beds all winter. We have mussels and others at our doors. Oysters we have none near, but we can have them brought by the Indians when we will. All the springtime the earth sendeth forth good salad herbs. Here are grapes, white and red, being almost as good as a damson. Abundance of roses, white, red, and damask, single but sweet indeed. This writer closes by writing, "Give God thanks, who hath dealt so favorably with us." Happy Thanksgiving.